We are close enough to the foliage that we really notice the lack of shadows. Since shadows add a nice sense of realism and depth, let's go ahead and fix that in the Light task mode. Select the Shadows category and Create. Confirm that we're going to create a new shadow with an attached vector. Now, a shadow component doesn't require bounding vector, but it saves render time and increases shadow quality. In the plan view, we will use the view angle of the Lake View camera to help us figure out where to put the bounding vector. So click above the camera icon, then the upper right corner, lower right corner, back behind the camera, right click to end digitizing, Lake View, the name, and confirm we're going to add the Lake View vector to the Lake View shadow. Close out the component gallery, and down here in the shadow editor, on the Cast Shadows page, set the shadows to cast. This controls the casting of shadows by terrain and foliage. Shadow casting by 3D objects and clouds is controlled in their respective editors. The Receive Shadows page determines what shadows will be received by the terrain. By default, it includes everything but volumetrics, which is usually everything you need. Save the project and render a Lake View preview. Once that starts, you will notice in the status window, shadow calculations have been added to the render process. If you look at the Lake View render, you may find that there are some trees that have no shadows and some shadows that have no trees. And this is what happens when we use variable fractal depth. If you go over to lower scene at a glance, make your way down to the terrain parameters and open that editor, you will see, sure enough, we are using variable fractal depth. The last time we talked about fractal depth methods, we learned that variable was for images and fractal maps were for animation. Well, as it turns out, if you are rendering shadows and you want them to be accurate, you should use fractal maps regardless of whether it's an image or an animation. You'll get more accurate shadows, which is a consideration if you're close like we are here. If you're looking at a whole valley scene and you don't have anything close and can't really see shadows and the trees casting them, you just see trees and shadows, then it's not a concern. But if you can clearly see where trees might or might not have shadows, you want to use fractal maps. Fractal depth maps are calculated using enabled render job cameras, so we have to add the Lake View camera to a render job. And render jobs up in the render task mode, render jobs category, open up the render job there and change the camera from main to Lake View. So we now have the camera Lake View part of an active render job. We can bring the terrain parameter editor forward and create fractal maps now. We're going to start at frame 0, yes. End at frame 0, yes. Which means it took no time at all to make that calculation. VNS will make a recommendation on what fractal depth to use. In our case, we know that 3 gives us the look we want, so we will go ahead and stick with 3. Let's change the plan view here to another Lake View and save the project, render preview. Let's go ahead and bring the shadow editor forward. You may have noticed in this render that we have changed the shadows, and you will find if you look carefully that the shadows go with trees, and there aren't any trees without shadows or shadows without trees, which is just what we were looking for. Now, by default, shadows are calculated before each render. That's good, since changes to light and foliage are going to change the shadows you have. However, when it comes time to render your final project and you are done moving everything, that's a good time to save render time in shadow calculation, and on the cast shadow pages in the editor, there is an option to use file. By doing that, the shadow map will be calculated once and then reused, which will save you a lot of render time if you're rendering an animation. You may have noticed in the view here we just rendered, there are some faint black facets, mostly here on the shadow side of the stream. VNS3's new terrain Phong shading has made this effect much less common than it was in VNS2, but it may still happen. If you see it, the solution is the same. Increase the shadow offset from terrain down here on the Cast Shadows page. Let's go ahead and try 0.5 meters and save the project. Render the upper left view. As a last finishing touch, let's go ahead and add some roughness to the beach here. It looks way too smooth. Let's go ahead and open the lake editor. On the beach page, we have an option for bump map texture. If you click that texture operations button and create texture, we'll just stay with the fractal noise default. And let's drop the intensity down to, I'm going to try 25%. Not much, but a little. And if we want the lake beach to match the stream beach, let's go ahead and copy that texture. Bring the stream forward, or double click on the stream to open its editor. Go to its beach, bump intensity of 25, and paste the texture. Save the project, render the right preview.